Now, muscle has three sources of ATP. Okay, we know what ATP is. We know that it's that energy reservoir. We know that it's needed to do cellular work. Now, these are the three sources that muscle can derive that ATP from. Two of them are more permanent, two of them are more sustainable, whereas this first mechanism is a transient, temporary, sort of like a backup reserve of energy for muscle to start its contraction, okay? And so to remind ourselves of the other two more permanent mechanisms, we looked at oxidative phosphorylation, right? All that stuff from unit 1, the electron transport chain. And so we should know now that this is a much more efficient source of energy production, simply because we generate much more ATP. Whereas anaerobic glycolysis is not an efficient source, right? We talked about glycolysis yielding not very much ATP, and so we can get some ATP here, but understand that oxidative phosphorylation is really golden in terms of energy production and the efficiency of that energy production. Okay, so we have a temporary transient source, we have a sustainable, permanent, more efficient source, and then we have this sort of in-between source that can get us through, but is not giving us as much ATP as reliably as oxidative phosphorylation. Let's speak about that first mechanism, the creatine phosphate system. Now, creatine is this molecule that we can use to store some energy for muscle contraction. And so this process generates a small amount of ATP at the beginning of muscle contraction. So when your muscles are at rest, there's no ATP usually. And so in order to get a contraction going, we need a transient source of ATP. Now, some of these other sources which we talked about, oxidative phosphorylation, anaerobic glycolysis, these take time to warm up. These need enzymes, these need transporters, these need the Krebs cycle. All of that takes time to warm up. And so the creatine phosphate system is a way to give us a brief temporary reserve of energy while the other more sustainable processes are actually warming up, okay? So what happens in this process? We can generate a small amount of ATP very quickly by taking creatine phosphate, which has a phosphate bound to it, and using the enzyme creatine kinase, we can make some ATP by snatching this phosphate off of creatine, putting it onto ADP, and making ATP that way, okay? So creatine is really just a placeholder for this phosphate, a really efficient placeholder for that phosphate. Now, this reaction is reversible, meaning that it can take place in the forward direction, where we make creatine and ATP, or it can take place in the reverse reverse direction, where we have ADP and creatine with this phosphate bound to it. So creatine is like a backup battery charger. If you have one of those for your phone that you walk around with, that's kind of what this system is. It's this phosphate on creatine, sort of as a placeholder for times when we really need a quick transient source of energy while the other more sustainable processes get warmed up, okay? Now, the law of mass action means that if there's lots of ATP in the muscle cell, we don't need this process. And so the reaction takes place in the backward direction, okay? We're gonna yield creatine phosphate. We're gonna yield creatine because creatine phosphate, which is going to the left, because we have lots of ATP and because we don't need this reaction running. Conversely, right, alternatively, if we have lots of ADP in the muscle fiber, that means we're sort of depleted of energy. And so the reaction is going to proceed in the right, where we can use that phosphate that's on creatine, sort of snatch it off, put it onto ADP, and make some energy. Now, this on-tap idea is that at the end of this, so when these other processes warm up, we now have lots of ATP in the cell. When oxidative phosphorylation gets going, when anaerobic glycolysis gets going, we have enough ATP, and so we can yield the creatine phosphate that's just sitting there on tap. It's just waiting for the next time we need that transient source of energy again, okay? So this is not a sustainable mechanism by no means, right? It generates a small amount of ATP, but it does so very quickly. And that is just to get things going while our other mechanisms warm up. All right, now we're going to speak about how muscle contracts during two states. We'll talk about how muscle contracts in light intensity exercise. So when I say light intensity, I'm talking about things like walking, maybe light jogging, moving around, things like that, versus heavy intensity exercise, which is sprinting, heavy lifting, vigorous activity, stress, right? You know that cortisol stress response stimulates muscle contraction, and that is a whole nother pathway. So moderate or light intensity exercise versus more heavier intensity exercise. Now, with light intensity exercise, the main source of energy is oxidative phosphorylation, okay? And that is simply because if you're exercising at a moderate rate, right, moderate intensity or light intensity, you can maintain your rate of breathing, usually, okay? If you're walking or light jogging, you can maintain your rate of respiration. What does oxidative phosphorylation need? What does oxidative phosphorylation need? What does oxidative phosphorylation absolutely need? Oxidative oxygen, right? It needs oxygen. So this is the aerobic energy production. So because we can maintain our respiration, oxidative phosphorylation is the main source of energy for lighter, more moderate intensity exercise. So let's look at the sequence of energy supply. So initially, at the start of light lifting, at the start of light jogging, at the start of walking, we use up our glycogen stores. The storage reservoir in our muscles and in our liver is glycogen, and we sort of exhaust those supplies first. It's more efficient for the body to use what it has than to start generating fresh ATP. And so we break down that glycogen store first. That lasts only about the first 30 minutes or so. Then we start to tap in to glucose and to some fatty acids that are in our blood. So depending on what our state is, whether we're in the fed state or we're in the fasted state, we sort of look to the blood for these other important sources of energy. If there's any circulating glucose, if there's any circulating fatty acids that we can tap into before we start to really get into the oxidative phosphorylation. Now, if you consistently continue that light intensity exercise, we sort of switch over to this more permanent source of energy, which is oxidative phosphorylation. And as you can see here, this takes over the energy production for light exercise. And the reason this takes over, as I mentioned earlier, is because we can increase our ventilation comfortably, right? If we're walking or light jogging, we can always increase our ventilation to meet the oxygen demand of oxidative phosphorylation. And we can sustain that, okay? This is why when doctors recommend that you do light intensity exercise, which is more efficient for your heart health, they always recommend that if you can maintain a conversation during that exercise, it's light intensity. When you can no longer maintain a conversation, that's where your ventilation is being affected, and you're going to shift away from oxidative phosphorylation because you're not adequately bringing in enough oxygen, okay? So we increase our heart rate, we increase the force of contraction, we dilate vessels to our muscles, and all of this can be sustained more easily in light intensity exercise. Lastly, here we increase the GLUT4 transporters. We talked a lot about these transporters. And these are the transporters that we insert into the membrane, these carrier proteins that help to bring glucose from the blood into our cells so we can use this energy, okay? So all of this is what helps to sustain light exercise. And just to reiterate here, we start off with that transient source, which is creatine phosphate, while these two get warmed up. Then we shift for about 30 minutes, sometimes you can even go to an hour. We shift over to anaerobic glycolysis very briefly, and then we move over to oxidative phosphorylation, and we can sort of sustain that. Okay, let's move on to heavy intensity exercise. So again, in terms of what this looks like, think about heavy lifting, think about sprinting, think about a 5K, right? More of that heavier intensity exercise, okay? Now the main source of energy here is anaerobic glycolysis. And why do we think this is? Why is it not oxidative phosphorylation? Why is it not oxidative phosphorylation? Good. We have very little oxygen coming in. Think about sprinting, right? Think about an 800-meter sprint. You're not going to be able to sustain that with your oxygen. You're not going to be able to ventilate your body enough to sustain that. And so what we do is we shift to this anaerobic glycolysis where we yield a smaller amount of ATP, but it's more comfortable it's more reliable to generate that ATP from this mechanism because we don't need oxygen. And oxygen is a problem if we are conducting heavy intensity exercise, right? It's not easy to keep the body ventilated under those conditions. And let's just jump back to this slide to remind ourselves of this process. So if we're breaking down glucose or glycogen, we typically yield pyruvate. Now, if these sources are exhausted, right, we cannot conduct oxidative phosphorylation in the absence of oxygen. And so this process gets halted. This gets halted, and we have a backup of pyruvate. Pyruvate starts to build up because it cannot go through the Krebs cycle and eventually through oxidative phosphorylation. And so what we have here is this shuttling pathway that turns all of this pyruvate that's now building up into lactate. And lactate is this acidic compound that builds up in our muscles when they are generating energy via anaerobic glycolysis. This is why we get the burn in muscle when we're doing heavier intensity exercise, again, such as running, long distances or sprinting, and heavy lifting, right? We get that burn because this is basically the price that we pay for that immediate source of energy, which is not as efficient as oxidative phosphorylation. So just to summarize here, we start off with that transient source, which is our creatine phosphate. We generate a small amount from oxidative phosphorylation because we are bringing in some oxygen, but it's not enough to sustain this type of muscle contraction. And so the major source that we see here for higher or heavy intensity exercise is anaerobic glycolysis.